Welcome to our 9th episode of Working the Word, a series in which we set out to understand how to understand the Bible better. We're back in the book of Genesis this week again.
There's lots in the book.
And what exciting stuff there is to find in this book.
Could spend a lot of time on this book. And
There's some real gems.
There are.
So we hope that you're going to enjoy a journey as we look at the good news that's found in the book of Genesis. Last week we looked at how it gave meaning to people who were coming out of slavery and out of captivity. It took them back to their roots. This week we're taking it another step because it gave them hope as they looked for their future and realised that they were in a world that was messed up.
And kind of set some of the patterns in motion for what was to come, kind of just giving them little glimpses of what was coming.
And we found that all the way through the book of Genesis. Often we just look at the first 6 chapters, flood, fall, creation, fall, flood, splitting up into different nations.
And skip a couple of the genealogies and just kind of a few of the highlights. But there's quite a lot in the book.
There's an amazing story, an amazing picture in there. We want to start in the book of Romans, because here Paul in verse 14 talked about death reigning from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come.
Which is kind of a concept we haven't really touched on yet.
It is. That word, a type, I think the New Living Translation put it, a representative. That he was the representative man created at the beginning, created perfect, put into a brand new world. And when he fell, God had to send a new representative man. As we go through Genesis, we're going to see a whole lot of people who fit into this, who are representatives of the one who was to come.
Even if it's not like 100% representation, there's just these sort of little glimpses that you get of this, the bigger story that is to come, like God is acting out his story in their lives as well, just so that, they're not going to be people who are going to see firsthand, how this is going to unfold, how God is going to do it, but he's giving them glimpses through their stories of how it's going to work.
And so, let's start at the very beginning. God said to Adam and Eve about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, don't eat from it, because if you do, in the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die.
Which creates a little bit of a problem in that the way things panned out,
they didn't. In fact, Adam lived for about another 900 and something years. And people have done all sorts of worming, screaming, they began to die. Well, that doesn't wash. Because God has said, in the day you eat, you'll die.
It's really quite clear.
And I think they would have died, except that God had a plan. And when God came to talk to them, he had something to say. He said, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, this is the serpent, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. A promise of a redeemer. But it's a little bit cryptic.
And it's the kind of promise that I think for generations they would have been mulling over just a little bit and sort of trying to figure out how it works.
What did he mean? How's it going to happen? Who will it be? Will it be my child?
And I think one of the characteristics is that there is a degree of not being clear because there is a lot more story to unfold. And once you start putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, it becomes a lot clearer, but we don't necessarily see that without the benefit of hindsight sometimes.
And if it's clear, then you stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
However, a little bit later when God was finished talking to them, God did something. And sometimes doing is more tangible than talking.
And I think with this particularly, it's not just that, he kind of took pity on them and covered them. He could have covered them other ways, I'm sure. But death did enter the world that day, just something else died in their place.
So Adam and Eve should have died.
Adam and Eve should have died.
And instead of them dying, a lamb died.
And because that lamb died, they were then covered.
But that lamb hadn't done anything wrong. It didn't deserve to die.
So even like we think about a lot of this stuff starting, with the sacrifices, but right back here, you have a lamb dying so that they can be covered, so that, sinful man can stand before a holy God.
But they didn't deserve that.
They didn't.
And so we get the picture not only of a powerful, wise God, we get the picture of a gracious God. And it's really his story that we're going to follow as we go through the book of Genesis today. A God who, just a little bit earlier that day, in the cool of the evening, had come walking in the garden. Here is God going for a walk.
Which is kind of really a beautiful image, I think. Like if you think about going for a walk with somebody, it tends to be just kind of, you're just spending time together. It just for the sake of being together. It's not there's not a race. You're not trying to prove anything. It's just I'll come over and we'll hang out for a bit.
When we come into the genealogies, an interesting one there is one of Enoch. And it says that Enoch walked with God after he had Methuselah.
And I think this is kind of interesting because, if you kind of look at it within the context of this story, we don't know much more about Enoch except that he walked with God. Like that's basically,
the whole
that's all you need to know.
that he walked with God, whatever that meant.
And, in this particular case, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. In other versions, it's, God, he didn't die. God picked him up and took him away. There was, an intimacy and a friendship within that relationship.
And it's almost like the New Testament hearing and believing. It's an ongoing thing rather than a...
It's not a set event. It's an ongoing relationship.
And perhaps we're getting just a clue as to what life might be meant to be like. And that brings us into a transition to Noah. And I notice just down the bottom of this one that Noah also walked with God.
If you're kind of keeping an eye out for it, there's quite a few of them that have that walked with God
There are.
marker on them.
But as we come to the flood, things are getting pretty chronic on planet Earth.
And you've got this really strong contrast made between how bad things are getting and between Noah finding favour in the eyes of the Lord, which is, again, one of those phrases that keeps popping up. And, righteous man, blameless in his generation, Noah walked with God. So you've got kind of before and after this declaration of the kind of person Moses was, we have this, the kind of state the world was in.
And despite the state that the world was in, Noah and his family is not in the same state that the world's in. Not that Noah is a perfect man.
No, he's not.
And that's made perfectly clear after the flood. When we get to the end of the book, Jacob, looking back, when he blesses Joseph, says, "The God whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked."
So we've got this walking theme that just sort of keeps coming up, and he's at the end of his life. In terms of him reflecting back, this is to him what feels like the key point here.
And we're going to find that they lived interesting lives as well.
They really did.
So this idea of walking with God that happened back for Adam, for Enoch, for Noah, for Abraham.
And it seems to be the kind of relationship he desires with his people. Like that's what he's trying to get to, even if it's imperfect. He's still, coming down and spending time with them, essentially.
So let's think about the flood. And some of the key words that just kept coming up here and coming up all the way through the book. Found favour in the eyes of the Lord. It'd be interesting to explore that, wouldn't it? What that means. And then his response to God speaking to him. He did all that the Lord commanded.
And I find it interesting that often it's in this order, that it's not, did all that the Lord commanded and found favour in the eyes. It was found favour in the eyes of the Lord and did all that the Lord commanded. Like the doing is almost kind of, like it's the response, but it's not the absolute key determinant on which the relationship is based. It's the relationship and as a result.
And then this intriguing expression, but God remembered. It occurs a number of times in this story.
And the ongoing story.
And the ongoing story, even in Egypt, God remembered the sufferings of his people.
And it's not necessarily to imply that, God forgot and then, oh yeah, I forgot about them. But that there's sort of this renewing of the memory of, these are my people and I haven't forgotten them. Particularly when they feel forgotten, that there's, I haven't forgotten.
And it's quite possible that during the building of the ark, Noah may have gone through some times where he said, where is God?
Well, the ark took 100, according to a bunch of the other stories, it was a really short time period, but it took 120 years? Mm-hmm. That's a fair amount of time.
And the Israelites were in Egypt for a long, long time, many centuries. They were in slavery and it must have felt like God had forgotten them. Mm. But God doesn't forget. It's a story in a very bad time of history of people making choices, and it's a salvation story. Mm. That all you had to do to be saved was basically get in the ark.
Walk up the ramp and hop on. And there wasn't any additional barriers placed. Like Noah was preaching, come on, basically. That's all you have to do.
All they have to do is believe that this is the place of safety and get on board. And fascinatingly enough, it's not Noah who says it's time to shut the door.
Mm. Noah has done all that he was told. He's made the preparations. The animals have arrived, not by his doing, but the animals have arrived. Everything's in preparation. But it was God who does that final seal. And there's kind of this image of God as the protector that, okay, you're all set, I'll hem you in.
We also touched on the Tower of Babel last week, where people said, well, we've heard what God said, but we're just not quite sure we're going to build a tower just in case God doesn't keep his word.
And I think that sort of, being kind of hedging your bets is something that again continues in a very human way throughout Genesis, but just kind of the acting as though he might not, just in case, because we're not sure.
And God, what would we have been tempted to do? Crash thunder. We'll teach this lot a lesson.
But one of the things that we notice with Noah is that when Noah comes out and sort of starts rebuilding, he makes a sacrifice, there's something that's changed. And there's a covenant that God makes with not just Noah, but Noah's descendants, and all the living creatures. Mm-hmm. That, I won't, the world is safe from this. Never again will I do this. And so you've kind of got these people who are still learning what trusting looks like, but that you've also beginning to have this formalized covenant between God and his people.
And it's called an everlasting covenant. Mm. And the other thing it recognises is the problem in the human heart. Mm.
And that, just because the flood has happened, it doesn't mean that inherently the nature of humanity has changed. Humans are still the same. Evil is still going to exist and it's still going to come back, but the covenant is made regardless of that.
And that's just fascinating.
Mm. And this concept of covenant just sort of seems to keep popping up, particularly through Genesis.
Covenant with Noah, and not only with Noah, with the whole earth. An everlasting covenant, an everlasting covenant with Abraham, mm-hmm. Covenant with Isaac. It just flows on and on.
And there's other places where it's maybe not as explicitly stated, but there is sort of that language of covenant that's made to other people, or an extension of that covenant that's made to other people.
And so as a basis of that, when God strikes these rebellious people, he's actually patient with them. He said, well, we'll split you up, we'll send you your different ways.
And in some ways there's a degree of mitigation, is that, we're going to separate you out, we're going to deal with this and minimise how much damage this can do before it makes damage, rather than there's sort of a very proactive involvement in human history there.
And very much an act of grace. So we come to Abraham. Oh dear. There's a famine. They're hungry, they go down to Egypt. And Abraham has said to his wife, don't let them know you're my wife, just tell them you're my sister. And the inevitable happens.
Just watching Abraham as a husband, I don't know that I'd be that keen, to be honest. And there's a big degree of fear that's sort of creeping through. If they think I'm married to you, they'll get rid of me so they can have you, kind of thing. But there's also say you're my sister so I can be safe.
Put you in danger so
Put you in danger so I'm safe.
It's not an act of faith.
No, it is not. And you've got lots of these that, he's been called out and makes this grand gesture of faith, leaving Ur or whatever. But then you've also got these tiny things along the way in which you get really clear glimpses that faith is not all the way there.
Abraham is still learning to trust God. And God actually has to work hard on this one to bail him out. That God sends a plague on Pharaoh and his house because of Sarah. And Abraham gets himself kicked out of Egypt, which I guess solves the problem, doesn't it? Abraham didn't deserve that.
No.
But that's what grace is all about. And then we find Abraham interceding with God on behalf of the city of Sodom.
Which I think is really interesting, because again, you've got this sort of almost face-to-face interaction that, yes, he's got his failings, but he's also kind of gutsy enough to stand up and negotiate with God. God says, I'm going to wipe this out. And Abraham goes, hold up, can we chat? There's this boldness in approaching God.
And negotiating. Well, look, if you can't find the 40, what about 35, 30, 20, 10? What if there's only... And he gets God willing, and I think God always wants people to repent. If there's 10 people there, I won't destroy it.
And I think we've got both of a sense here of, the relationship that God has with Abraham, that Abraham is allowed to ask for this kind of stuff. And that, God allows him to haggle down. But at the same time, I almost wonder whether God was trying to teach Abraham something.
And is this what walking with God is all about?
And sometimes we kind of have this sense, when God says something like that, we don't tend to be like, hang on, can we chat? It tends to be a little bit more, well, God said it, I better behave, I don't want to upset him, kind of thing. And this understanding of a relationship with God kind of negates that kind of thinking. If you're walking with him and conversing rather than sort of trying not to mess up and...
You can ask questions. And God seemed to be perfectly happy with it. At this point, the angels go down to the city of Sodom. And they don't get a real welcoming welcome in Sodom.
Not particularly, no.
The people are quite inhospitable. But when they say to Lot, it's time to leave, Lot also does some negotiating. Well, look, you want to go too far. Can I go to this closer city? And in Genesis 19, basically they are dragged by the collar to get them out.
But God also allows some wiggle room and says, okay, that nearer city is fine.
Mm-hmm. And the Lord being merciful to him, they brought him out and set him outside the city. And again, it's almost like Lot doesn't deserve it. And he doesn't even realise the danger he's in. And God even gives Lot's wife the freedom to turn back.
I mean, there are still consequences to turning back, but there's no force here.
Next in the story is She Is My Sister, part 2. Just in case you're wondering, Abraham's a little bit of a slow learner on this occasion. Another famine. He doesn't go to Egypt. He goes down to Gerar, where Abimelech is in charge.
And by all accounts that we get, Abimelech was a pretty good guy.
He's honourable.
And there is some evidence that there is some degree of faith already there, even if there's sort of, there's not the details. And sometimes we get the sense that where God is placing people, they're being placed there to be a blessing to the people around them. I don't know that Abraham came through on that entirely, but that, the seeds had already been sown in that community and God was placing Abraham there to be a blessing. And
he digs himself a hole.
He digs himself a hole again.
She is my sister. Oh dear, what's God going to do with, you're supposed to learn, aren't you? Mm. And God graciously comes to Abimelech in a dream at night and says, don't touch her. And Abimelech comes to Abraham, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Oh, I was afraid.
And I think that pervasive fear is one of the things that actually is most likely to keep us away from, being able to be that influence, because we're too afraid of what the consequences might be, what people will think. And I think Abraham's got a massive attack of the anxiety here.
The fear wobbles. Mm. And he is still learning that God can be trusted. And again, God just gets him out of it, puts him back on track.
And I think some of what we're really seeing is, that God is saying this is what you got to do, but even when Abraham doesn't kind of follow through on what he's supposed to be doing, God still acts to pick him up and care for him, despite, what he's supposed to be doing.
And through it all, Abraham is learning about God. Mm. That it's a walk, it's a journey. You're not there at the beginning, but he is in that walk, in that relationship. The next story that comes up in the book of Genesis is the story of Hagar.
Which is kind of interesting because we've got, particularly in the story of Abraham, there's sort of a symmetry that, there's sort of things that happen at both ends in the way it's arranged, that, there's a symmetry that you kind of follow this progression and then it progresses the same way out. But we've got this story of Hagar right in the middle, which to me is a really intriguing story because, the reason she's in this mess is because of the lack of faith from Sarah. So when Abraham has a lack of faith, Sarah is the one who kind of gets thrown into the deep end. Mm. When Sarah has a lack of faith, it's Hagar who gets kind of thrown into the middle of what she was never intended to be in. And the situation becomes intolerable and Hagar leaves and is found by an angel in the desert. Now, we're not told a lot about that, but just sort of based on what we find out later, there's kind of this sense that God's come looking for her, which, seeing as that, she's an Egyptian servant, is kind of an interesting kind of detail because she's, as an Egyptian servant, she's not really part of God's people as they're understanding this covenant to be. And yet And, even taking the perspective that, this being compiled for people reading coming out of slavery. So you've got this woman who's an Egyptian, who's an Egyptian slave, and God, takes the trouble to go and find her in the desert.
And it's interesting to look at the actual text there. The actual angel actually comes to her with a promise.
I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude, which sounds a whole lot like the promise that was given to Abraham.
It's exactly the promise that was given to Abraham.
Even though this isn't the way it was supposed to pan out, and this isn't the direction that God intends to take that promise, that, he's honouring this promise to her anyway. We've also got some symmetry here in, the angel of the Lord said, behold, you're pregnant and shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael. And that language is again kind of reminiscent of some other places we see it.
I'm hearing an echo of the New Testament, where God comes to Mary and says, you will bear a son and you will give him the name. This seems to be a...
And like in a little bit when we get to Isaac, there's again that, you will have a son and you will call him. There's not too many babies that are named by God in the Bible, but like this essentially illegitimate child of an Egyptian slave is being extended this covenant.
And she calls on the name of the Lord. She's got a name for him.
And one of the things, like it comes through more in some of the other translations, but, you are the God who sees me. Now, we don't really, before this, have a lot of us naming God. And here you have this Egyptian woman who's giving a name to God, and her experience of God is, you are the God who sees me.
It's a real picture of grace.
It really is. And like, she's one of the people in society who's a lot more likely to be invisible and not seen. And you've got God, like not just an ordinary person, you've got the God of the Abraham, seeking her out to extend the blessings to her, even though this isn't the way it was supposed to go.
And God also has to work with Abraham, because Abraham now has a son, and he's saying, well, look, couldn't it be that Ishmael's my heir? And God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac.
Here we go again.
We just saw that expression, didn't we?
But I think, we've also got here that, Abraham and Sarah have been kind of trying to do it their way. And God's like, no, I'm still, the plan is still on track here. We're still going with this way. We will work with the mistakes that you've made, but this doesn't derail the plan.
And this Ishmael, Abraham, I have heard you. I've blessed him. I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He's going to father, etc.
But.
But, and I always put but in red. I normally circle it when I'm doing it.
Because there's sort of a really key moment where you're saying, but there's a change here.
Yeah, I'm going to bless him. I'm going to make him fruitful. I'm going to multiply him. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac.
And again, you've got the symmetry here in that we've got, when he's proclaiming that this is going to happen, I will establish my covenant with him. Ishmael will be fine. I will look after him, but I will establish my covenant with Isaac.
And Isaac's not even conceived yet. But we already have a name for this baby. And God took him outside, said, look towards heaven, number the stars, so shall your offspring be. And verse 6 is one that the New Testament picks up.
In Galatians.
And also in Romans. And he believed the Lord. And he, the Lord, counted it to him as righteousness. That the attribute that God is looking for in human beings is, do you trust me?
And even if that trust is wavering, like you've still got almost that, I believe, help my unbelief kind of moment that, this there are plenty of examples where Abraham's faith is clearly a little bit lacking, and yet you have these moments where, you know, God takes him outside and, you know, there's no industrial light or anything around. It is a sky full of stars, like full of stars. And God says, you know, your descendants, you know, to the childless guy, your descendants will be as many as these. Like that's a really audacious promise to make, and to sort of believe that that can be possible, particularly with both of them. Well, Sarah's well past childbearing age. And that this promise is made, but it takes a while to come to fruition.
But it does come to fruition. And so we come to Isaac coming onto the scene. A promised child. Yeah? Here is the promise of God in flesh.
And, you know, there's been quite a while since that promise was made. That, you know, when the first time God promised to make him into a great nation is quite a long time ago. And, you know, it's something that stayed with Abraham because he and Sarah are kind of trying to figure out how to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. And how to help God make it happen.
Yes.
How human.
Very human.
So the birth is a miracle. It's probably as hard as a virgin birth. Here is his beloved son, and that word is used.
They make specific, like it's, you know, your son, your only son, kind of, there's a real strong emphasis on that phrasing. Which, again, kind of, you know, makes us think of passages in the New Testament.
It does. In fact, the New Testament says his only, his unique.
You've kind of got that really strong link between, you know, we're starting to get like little glimpses and pictures of the story that is to come. Like God isn't trying to tell Abraham what is going to happen. God is trying to show Abraham. So Abraham's kind of living in this almost theatrical recreation of what is coming.
So we have a type here. And God tells him that he's to offer Isaac
as a sacrifice.
Interestingly, the place they go is Mount Moriah.
Which is the place that later the temple was built on.
Interesting, isn't it?
So you've kind of got the, you know, this sacrificial symbol happening on Mount Moriah, and, you know, just as things panned out, that is where kind of the rest of that system proceeded onwards, really.
It is. And as the offering, Isaac doesn't resist, it seems.
There's no real sort of, you know, Abraham kind of has the God will provide, and Isaac's just, all right. There's no evidence that he was a little bit upset about it or anything, that it was just, okay, if this is...
And we look at what he's carrying. He's carrying a load of wood.
Which is the wood he is to be
sacrificed on. And Jesus, a little bit later on, when he goes to be sacrificed,
he's carrying his cross.
He's carrying his wood.
And I think particularly where you've got this, you know, this idea of God will provide the lamb for the offering, that, you know, Abraham is still trusting that something will turn up or whatever, but if it doesn't, then he's willing to go through with it. But I'm wondering if God was trying to give Abraham a little bit of a taste of the love that he had and the lengths he was willing to go to. That, you know, clearly God did provide so that wasn't necessary, but God was helping Abraham to understand how far he was willing to go to save his people.
And Isaac's obviously old enough to be observant. Dad, we've got the fire, we've got the wood. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And I'm not sure what was in Abraham's throat as he said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. An angel stops him. And he looks around, and here in a bush is a ram caught by its horns.
And we start getting this picture of God as provider once again, that, you know, God doesn't necessarily really need our help. That I think he was trying to help Abraham understand here, but it wasn't that he actually needed Isaac as a sacrifice. It was that he was trying to give Abraham a picture, but God already had that all covered.
And instead of Isaac dying, the ram dies in his place. It's almost an echo of that first one back in Eden, isn't it?
It's also kind of interesting when we get to, like, it sort of extends a little bit that, you know, when this only son, you know, Abraham's getting on in years and Isaac is still not married.
He's 40.
He's 40. And so Abraham sends out Eliezer.
It's interesting, Eliezer's name means God's helper.
You almost indicate like just sort of little hints of the work of the Holy Spirit in this one. That, you know, God's sending his helper out. And even, you know, sending his helper out to bring a bride home for his only son. Like, there's some echoes in there.
And when he gets there, Rebekah is called out of a far country to go with a man she'd never met before, to marry a man that she'd never seen.
Well, there's kind of this really strong idea that she's stepping out in faith here. That, you know, there is so many unknowns here, but she's willing to trust and step forward to be with this person just because of, you know, who she's told that he is.
And the circumstances, he has prayed, and I'm sure that story impacted her. The hand of God at work. Abraham is dead, and Isaac and Abimelech have a "she is my sister" moment.
You would kind of think that, you know, Abimelech has fallen for this one before, that he might be a little bit, hey, hang on, I remember. And yet there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Abimelech kind of has anything but trust for Isaac. At least initially.
Abimelech looks out the window and sees them cuddling up in a way the brother and sister would probably not cuddle up.
And once again is a little bit upset.
And he is upset because one of the men might have taken her, and he has to say, look, don't touch her. In this chapter, God has promised that he would bless him, and that year he sows and he reaps an enormous crop. And we struggle with that. How dare God bless this man who's just had one of those "she is my sister" moments?
And, like, you know, there's this, it's not just blessing, it's like blessing. It's, you know, a massive reward considering how much he's just screwed up.
Could it be that God gives us things that we don't deserve?
I think the entire book is evidence.
This is a pattern that's flowing through the whole book, this walk with God, that God takes these stumbling saints.
And I think, you know, particularly if you're looking at this context that we were talking about last week, where, you know, these are people who have come out of slavery, who have come out of exile, having these stories where their forefathers sank, were lifted out, sank, were lifted out, that, you know, God keeps giving them things that they don't deserve, I think is kind of setting them back up for that relationship with God. That it's setting up a God who will keep looking after them and keep rescuing them even when they don't deserve it, which is probably a message they really needed to get at that point.
And it's at this point that Isaac goes out and starts to dig wells and leave a trail of blessings behind him for the people of the land.
And I think this is actually one of the first instances where we're starting to see, you know, that promise made through, the covenant made through Abraham, and the promise that, you know, your descendants will be a blessing to all nations, that their presence was supposed to be a blessing, and here we actually have Isaac doing something that is blessing the nation he's in.
And blessing and blessing and blessing. So we move to his descendants, Jacob. And I guess the story we best know about Jacob is the way he set out and deceived his brother Esau about the birthright, with mum's help.
And once again, it's one of those situations where it's promised and Rebekah thinks that she maybe needs to help God along a little bit.
Oh, okay, so God can't do it on his own. God needs assistance to get this birthright thing happening. Esau is very pleased about this, so pleased that he wants to kill Jacob.
And Jacob has to kind of exit post-haste.
Heading north, heading for uncle's place. And the first night out, he lies down, all he's got to put his head on is a rock. And we say, what does he deserve? You know, what did he think was going to happen?
Pretty much deserves to be out in the wilderness sleeping on a rock.
And as he does, he gets a picture of angels going up and down a staircase to heaven. He's messed up, but God hasn't walked away from him. God hasn't left him on his own.
And there's still that sort of connection and you know, there is space between them, that there is a relationship still, that it's not, you know, complete abandonment, that, you know, there is still a connection between him and God, even if he's off in the wilderness on his own.
And God actually gives him a promise that he will be with him. Totally of grace, certainly not earned, not deserved. He goes, he works for Uncle Laban. Uncle Laban has these deceiving ways too. He ends up with, I was going to say 4 wives, until he's on his way back. And it's instructive just to see him heading back to meet with Esau. God has told him to go back. It's all going to be well.
And I find it interesting that we've also kind of got, you know, Jacob still remembers how things were and Jacob is terrified. And so Jacob prays, you know, God, please, you know, look after this meeting. I don't know what to do here. But, you know, please protect us and don't forget the covenant. Like he goes out of his way to sort of, don't forget that you promised, like I'm holding you to that. And yet the way he acts is very much not representative of somebody who genuinely trusts.
And of someone who's just wrestled all night with an angel, been promised a blessing. And in Genesis 32 and 33, we have him sending out heaps and heaps and heaps of...
There's like 200 goats, 220 goats, 220 sheep, 30 camels, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 feet. Like there's this massive menagerie that he's sending ahead, trying to sort of sweeten the deal so that Esau will not kill him. He splits his family and you know, all his livestock into 2 groups so that if Esau comes after one, at least the others will live. Like this is not a confident person right now.
It doesn't sound like walking in faith.
It does not. And then, like, you know, he encounters Esau and, you know, bows down on his face 7 times, like an absolute submission thing. And then the handmaids and their kids do, and then Leah and her kids do, and Rebekah and Joseph do the same thing. So you've got all this absolute submission just in terror of what Esau might do. And even, like, the language, you've kind of got Jacob going, you know, this is what God has blessed me with, my Lord, please don't be angry. And you've got Esau going, I've got stuff, come here, my brother, kind of. And you've got this magnanimous picture of love from Esau and this giant picture of fear from Jacob.
That faith needs actually to be followed through, that his salvation wasn't on all the gifts that he gave.
And I think perhaps, like, you know, we've got in between him preparing to meet Esau and him actually meeting Esau, we've got that little story in the middle of Jacob wrestling with God. And I think that there was some things that he needed to go through before he actually met with his brother. Because just in some of the ways there's changes in language. That, you know, this is a growing relationship. He's still learning. And I think God coming down and having that encounter with him is again, a really strong picture of a God who was there for us and willing to teach us. And even if it's not necessarily a lesson we're enjoying.
And it's a name-changing experience. That he goes from Jacob to Israel, the Prince of God.
And the naming of that is symbolic even. That it's not just sort of I've picked a better name for you, I've picked a name that represents who you are to me.
Because Jacob means supplanter, deceiver.
Which he'd lived up to be fair.
He certainly earned that one, but now he is given a new name. You're catching a picture of God as we go through these stories, a consistent God who just loves to walk with people.
And one of the indications is that one of the things that Israel means is he struggles with God, that this experience is absolutely pivotal in both his identity and the identity of the generations to come. That there is this hands-on relationship with God.
And so we come to maybe the most fascinating story of them all, the story of Joseph. A young man who was sent by his father to look for his other sons who weren't where they were supposed to be. A young man who finds himself despised and rejected by his brothers.
And not just sort of, despised and rejected in a small way, in a basically at the end of this you're dead to us kind of way.
We have a blood-stained coat. Obviously, a goat was sacrificed to put some blood on this coat. As far as they was concerned, he was dead, he was gone, he was out of their sight forever.
And again, we're starting to get a few just kind of, wait, that sounds a little familiar moments.
He's sold for 20 pieces,
30 pieces.
30 pieces of silver.
I think.
No, 20.
20.
20. By the time of Jesus, the price of a slave had gone up to 30 pieces of silver. Yeah, quite a whole lot of inflation in the 1800 years, wasn't it?
But you also kind of get a sense of how little value that was perceived to have. That, a little bit of silver.
Not even enough for 2 bits each.
Yes.
And what we see is an enormous contrast with the character of his brothers. In the preceding chapters, Reuben has been caught sleeping with one of his father's wives. Judah has got his daughter-in-law pregnant. And there's just a whole lot of dishonourable conduct on their part. And Joseph, as a slave with so little value, goes to Egypt and resists the advances of Potiphar's wife.
And I think one of the, you've got these stories placed side by side for a reason, because you're supposed to notice these differences.
These contrasts.
And so, sometimes if we just sort of flip through and just read this particular chapter, we're not sort of seeing some of the contrasts that are placed there to kind of really emphasise points here. But
the story ends that he is used by God to save his whole family, to save multitudes of people who live in that area.
And I think, even just in that, the act of rejection and essentially you're dead to us that his brothers made kind of, was the catalyst for all of this happening. That, later on in the book we've got, everybody's come to Egypt by this point. Isaac has died. No, Jacob has died. And Joseph's brothers are kind of a little bit like, oops, dad's gone. What's Joseph going to do to us? We need to just kind of he'll kill us. And, they sort of, they kind of send word to Joseph that your father left these instructions, like Dad said, so I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God of your father. And their message comes to Joseph and he weeps. That it's not this kind of leads into you guys, you meant evil, you intended to harm me, but God used that for good. And we've very much got that symmetry with the story that happened, that what the actions that we took against Jesus, we did to harm him. And yet God took that and used it to be, for the saving of many lives.
And it's interesting, this is the story that Stephen uses before the Sanhedrin. And he talks about a man despised and rejected by his brothers and used by God to save the nation.
And you kind of get the sense that he's seen this symmetry.
He's seen the symmetry. He's seen that this is just a little picture of the bigger picture that is to come.
And as you've got them with all these stories compiled and all these little bits are just starting to give you a glimpse of what's coming, and while at the time they might not necessarily have seen it cumulatively as they're telling those stories, it adds up.
To a God who is working hard to save people. Working hard so that people will trust that he will do what he says. That if you'll walk with him, that it'll turn out okay.
And I think the emphasis on walking with him is one of the really strong things we're supposed to get out of this, that it's not if you obey, things will go well. It's based on that relationship. Now, yes, if you obey, things will go better. But if you disobey, it doesn't necessarily mean all bets are off, covenant's gone, you're on your own.
That God will work if you are willing to bring you around and to maintain that relationship.
And not just sort of work with your mistakes, but be able to be kind of giving you glimpses of his plan for you through your story.
And so Genesis has set us up for the most exciting plan that the whole Bible is all about. And it's...
I think we really need to in that, be really grasping how the character of God is critical to this. It's not just kind of all these human things happen and God poked his nose in every now and then, that you've got the character of God being really critical to how we're understanding this.
I will be with you is a phrase that occurs and occurs. I make this covenant with you. It's almost, I will never leave you or forsake you.
It's along the same kind of feel.
And in this passage here, it's almost in all things God works for the good of those who love him.
And particularly, some of these New Testament writers, they've been raised hearing these stories. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wonder if there's many nights of reflection going, oh, I see how that fits. I get it.
Well, the people in the Sanhedrin got it. Yes. They didn't want to get it.
Yes.
The story got through when the theory didn't.
And I think that's one of the ways that God operates, in that he doesn't necessarily wait for the theory to sink in before he acts.
And what we've seen God doing today is not so much on the theory side. We had a little bit, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed, and this is how it's going to work out. That was the theory. But when we look at God's actions, it helps us to understand what he says.
And I think it helps us get an understanding of how he's wanting us to act. And, for example, right back in the beginning of Genesis, where God gives dominion to the people, if our understanding of dominion is, a domination, like the human idea of, domination, we have a lot of the colonial, we will march and claim and destroy whatever kind of is against us. Whereas if you're looking at dominion from the perspective of how God reigns over his people. Of how
cares and blesses.
And, there's a responsibility and a care for. And so, just looking at that perspective of what we're learning from what God is doing gives us a really different picture of what he means when we're supposed to be caring, reigning over the planet, that it's a reign of care, of responsibility, of relationship that we're responsible for. It's not just here's your toy and when you break that one, I'll give you a new one kind of thing. That there's a relationship and a responsibility that sort of doesn't come through if you just go, oh yeah, dominion, fair enough.
One word that we didn't pick up on is the word bless. We could have done that alongside covenant.
Because the blessing and the covenant usually go hand in hand, that the covenant isn't just sort of you have to live by the rules. The covenant is, I will make you a blessing.
I will bless you, and through your offspring all nations of the earth will be blessed.
And blessing is one of the concepts that really comes up a lot in Genesis. There's like pages of just references to blessing, that it's one of those sort of anchor points that seems to be a marker of relationship.
And a marker of how we can live in the world. To pray, God, make me a blessing to someone today.
And it almost has the overtones of, the New Testament. We know how to do this. We know how to love because we have been loved. And in this case, we've got we know how to be a blessing to the world around us because we know how we have been blessed.
Our takeaway, our tip for you this week, if you want to understand the Bible in the book of Genesis, is look at God's actions. Look at how God has blessed people. Look at his patience with people. This will help you to understand the things that he tells you, the things that he says.
And I think it gives you a much clearer picture of his heart and his intention than just stopping at the words itself.
It might sound trite, but actions sometimes speak louder and clearer than words. And in the book of Genesis, God's actions have shown us a whole lot about what he is like. We'll post some of the resources that we've used in exploring the book of Genesis on the Facebook page, Working the Word. There's a link to it from the Lithgow, Oberon and Mudgee Seventh-day Adventist Church websites. Thank you for joining us today for Working the Word. We hope that you can be with us next week as we continue to explore how to understand the Bible.